The sky above Valyria had always seemed aflame, especially at dusk, when sun-burnished clouds hung like glowing embers over a city built on the mastery of flame and scale. In this age, the city's might rose higher than ever, untouched by cataclysmic ruin. There was no doom, no shattering of the hills, no choking ash to drown out the horizon. Instead, the freehold of Valyria continued unbroken, spreading its wings further across Essos and now into the west. This alternate path began in a quiet moment, in the year that the fated eruption never occurred, when small tremors beneath the 14 flames rattled the great forges but quickly stilled. The priests of the Red Temple read omens in the flickering fires, but they saw only the usual swirl of half-glimpsed shapes. Dragons in flight, swords in flame, swirling plumes of color that told them the gods of light were ever vigilant. When the final quake subsided, and the molten rivers receded rather than boiled over, the city's oracles proclaimed that the future was clearer than ever. Valyria would stand eternal. A century passed, then another, and the empire solidified its dominion. The freehold, governed by its ancient families, the Dragonlords who soared astride beasts both magnificent and terrifying, found unity in shared prosperity. Their conquests reached the Summer Sea and east to Slaver's Bay, capturing the wealth of entire continents. Where once the Valyrian highway ended, new roads were built over mountains, bridging deserts with cunning engineering. No force proved strong enough to topple them, for what army could stand against the might of 100 dragons overhead? Yet for all their triumphs, pride simmered at the core of the empire's soul. These families, each possessed of their own monstrous serpents of fire and muscle, vied with each other for recognition, influence, and the favor of the freehold's collective leadership. Still, they remained bound together by the unbreakable premise. Valyria had thrived for 5,000 years, and it would thrive for 5,000 more. Among the many mighty families, House Targaryen had once been considered lesser. They were overshadowed by the greatness of the Celtigars, Valerians, Gainairs, and other storied lines whose dragons were rumored to be older and fiercer. Yet House Targaryen had something that many did not: a measured caution. Generations ago, Daenerys the Dreamer had foreseen a catastrophe that would swallow Valyria in ash. The Targaryens, in that alternate reality, fled to Dragonstone and became the seeds of a new order in Westeros. But here, in a world where Daenerys' visions never solidified into certain doom, they remained. They maintained a half-curious watchfulness while the rest of Valyria soared in unchallenged pride. As the centuries rolled on, the Targaryens slowly rose from a footnote in the rosters of Dragonlords to a family of renown, thanks to prudent marriage alliances and the cunning of their matriarchs. No single twist of fate elevated them, but over long years, they proved loyal to their peers, wise in trade, and subtle in forging bonds with newly conquered territories. The extension of Valyrian rule into Westeros began in earnest after the subjugation of the Rhoynish city-states reached its final conclusion. The proud Rhoynar had once pinned their hopes on the warrior queen Nymeria, but in this new timeline, the might of an unbroken freehold crushed even the bravest rebellions. Nymeria's flight to Dorne ended not in an alliance with House Martell but in a desperate negotiation with Valyrian generals. Her people scattered along the coasts of southern Westeros, forming enclaves under the watchful eyes of garrisons stationed in Old Town, Lannisport, and other major ports. The Rhoynar never fully integrated with the Undulls and First Men who already populated the continent, but under Valyrian rule, they found themselves one subjugated people among many. Even so, their memory of resistance persisted. In the early days of conquest, the Dragonlords arrived in Westeros in scattered waves, each ambitious family staking claims where their interests lay. Some targeted the goldfields of the Westerlands, others set their sights on the fecund Riverlands, while still more soared northward to measure the rocky coasts of the Vale. The Iron Islands proved a challenge. Rebellious, hardy folk who worshipped the drowned god resisted aerial assaults by hiding in sea caves and employing deadly black bolts aimed at the dragons overhead. Yet, one by one, these kingdoms bent the knee or broke entirely. The freehold's strength was overwhelming. Castles of the ancient houses crumbled beneath dragonfire, and those who would not submit were swept into the sea. The few who survived spoke in hushed, bitter tones of the unstoppable might descending from the sky. But for all the destruction, many still found it beneficial to align themselves with the new overlords. Taxation was heavy but consistent, and once a local lord agreed to bow, he often found himself left in place, albeit with Valyrian overseers perched in the high towers, watching every move. Though many families of Westeros had cause to resent the conquerors, some saw opportunity. House Lannister, for example, recognized the chance to maintain their gold-mining wealth if they played the game of alliances carefully. They offered tributes of gold and extended their genealogical lines to Valyrian scions, forging a link of blood that turned former conquerors into allies. The high towers of Old Town proved similarly resourceful, welcoming the Draconic lords to the greatest library in the known world and granting them space to spread their religion, whether it was the worship of the Lord of Light or the mystical traditions of Valyria's own arcane pantheon. Even the faith of the Seven, stern and devout, found a sort of uneasy coexistence. The High Septon in Old Town preached caution, proclaiming that the Seven might have allowed these flame-wielding conquerors as a test of resolve. He counseled patience, not open war, aware that any defiance would be met with a hail of dragon flame. Over a span of decades, Westeros was carved into new provinces under Valyrian oversight. The Targaryens, still striving for prestige, established their seat on Dragonstone, but this time it was not an island refuge. Instead, it was a strategic fortress from which they helped coordinate the subjugation of the entire continent. Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes were not yet hatched in this timeline, but Targaryen dragons still soared over Blackwater Bay. Houses Stark, Baratheon, and Martell each faced their own crucible. The North bent but remained proud, their wards hammered out in a chilly alliance that afforded them a measure of autonomy. For few in Valyria relished a campaign in the frozen extremes beyond the Neck. Storm's End initially resisted fiercely, paying a heavy price when a coalition of Dragonlords descended to burn fields and break the famed fortress walls after a lengthy siege. The proud Dorne also tried to fight back, using their desert terrain and guerrilla tactics. Their defiance, storied in another timeline, here met unrelenting waves of conquest. Ultimately, Dorne too broke, though it was said that the price the freehold paid in blood was heavier than anywhere else. The century that followed was a time of transitions. Valyrian roads were laid across the continent, connecting once isolated regions. Grand outposts were built with pale marble and fused black stone, reminiscent of the architecture that had made Valyria the envy of the world. These outposts served both as military garrisons and hubs of trade, where caravans laden with silk, spices, and steel arrived from Essos. With each new construction project, Westeros became more deeply embedded in the tapestry of the empire. Languages began to intermingle. The common tongue remained, but High Valyrian words slipped into everyday speech, especially among the merchant class. Lords sent their heirs across the narrow sea to study in Valyrian academies, learning arcane arts and forging cross-continental alliances. So it was that the greatest families of Westeros found themselves participating in the affairs of a vast empire, each vying for the ear of the Dragonlords who represented them in the councils of the freehold. While trade thrived and roads improved, resentments simmered. Where dragons soared, men bowed their heads in terror, old hatreds never fully extinguished. In the sprawl of the capital, the city of Valyria itself, the Dragonlord's rivalries grew more pronounced with each passing decade of unbroken rule. The constant expansions had made them wealthy beyond measure, but also restless. New conquests were no longer as challenging, for what corner of the known world had not felt their flames? Slave labor abounded. In the glittering manors along the banks of the lava rivers, thousands of souls toiled for the proud masters of the freehold. The city's mosaic plazas shone with inlaid silver and gold filigree. Marble statues of dragon riders soared from tall pedestals. Each family sought to outdo the other in public works, funding amphitheaters, coliseums, and temples to the gods. In this environment, the Targaryens learned to navigate politics with a deft hand. Never the wealthiest nor the mightiest, they nurtured alliances across the seas, subtly strengthening their hold in Westeros. They saw that while the other Dragonlord families enjoyed fleeting alliances, they never fully committed to the governance of Westeros beyond extraction of wealth. that left a vacuum of sorts, an opportunity for House Targaryen to become the de facto caretakers of the province, bridging the old traditions of the continent with the new imperial order. Indeed, on Dragonstone, the Targaryens invested in building not just a fortress but a center of diplomacy. Lords, ladies, merchants, and scholars traveled from the mainland to the island for counsel. Some came to beg for reduced taxes. Others sought the intervention of Targaryen scions in local disputes, hoping that a word from a Dragonlord might temper the cruelty of local overseers. Over time, Targaryen influence expanded, not solely through fear, but through a measure of understanding and fairness that seemed lacking in the older, more arrogant families of Valyria. The Targaryens took careful note of local customs, forming close ties with the faith, and even occasionally granting concessions to the small folk, thus earning a reputation, perhaps contrived, perhaps genuine, for a lighter hand. Generations passed, and these shifts bore fruit. On the mainland, massive fused stone roads now connected King's Landing, a port city built up from a humble fishing town under Valyrian planning, with Old Town, Lannisport, and beyond. Ships bearing the freehold's dragon sigils patrolled the seas to guard against pirates, ensuring trade was safe and profitable. Though the presence of dragons was still a fearful sight, some in Westeros began to appreciate the empire's stability. Banditry was less common, commerce flourished, and the lines of petty warfare that had once separated kingdoms were replaced by a single, if heavy-handed, authority. Yet under that unified rule, local cultures began to erode in the face of the empire's grand assimilation. In many towns, the worship of the Valyrian gods merged uneasily with the faith of the Seven, resulting in confusion and the occasional riot. Stubborn worshippers of the old gods in the north clung to their weirwoods with defiance, but even they felt the creeping influence of Valyria. Their children learned snatches of High Valyrian, and some northern lords found it more profitable to trade furs and ice lore across the sea than to brood in isolation. As the empire stabilized its hold, talk among the Dragonlords turned to new expansions and the exploration of the unknown. At the grand summits in Valyria, seats of polished obsidian ringed a central stage. The lords convened amidst a swirl of competing perfumes and incense. Courtesans with painted faces drifted between them, offering spiced wine. Philosophers and warlocks were invited to pontificate on distant realms. They spoke of the jungles beyond Sithorios, of the mysterious shadowlands beyond Ashai. Meanwhile, some called for deeper inroads into the shivering sea, speculating on trade routes with peoples rumored to live beyond the horizon. For the moment, it seemed no threat existed to challenge the empire's supremacy. Any talk of looming catastrophe or wrathful gods was dismissed as nonsense. The doom that had once been whispered in caution had never arrived, and so faith in Valyria's eternal greatness only grew. Still, within the empire's expanse, cracks spread below the surface. The burden of endless slavery drained the morale of subjugated peoples, generating sporadic uprisings. On the continent of Essos, such revolts were often crushed swiftly, with entire cities left in ruin as warnings to others. In Westeros, the rebellious spirit simmered but found few outlets. Whenever a local lord dared to champion the idea of independence, a flight of dragons would appear in the sky, or legionnaires in gleaming Valyrian steel marched across the land, putting an end to such dreams. Even so, pockets of resistance festered in the mountains of the Vale, in the labyrinthine forests of the Neck, and within the hidden glens of the north. The Iron Islands refused to submit quietly, launching reaving expeditions against Valyrian outposts. Although their efforts often ended in bloodshed, the Ironborn never lost their thirst for defiance. In the courts of Dragonstone, House Targaryen found itself juggling a delicate balance. On one hand, they remained loyal to the freehold, participating in the grand sessions and supporting joint campaigns in distant lands. On the other, they realized that Westeros was not merely a province to be milked for coin. Its peoples had a fierce identity, forged by centuries of petty kings and local traditions. Real power meant nurturing the hearts and minds of these men and women. Over time, the Targaryens evolved a soft power approach. By appointing local lords to positions of provincial authority, they gave a semblance of respect to Westerosi traditions, even while ensuring that the final say always rested in Targaryen, and thereby Valyrian, hands. Lord Enar Targaryen, a pragmatic leader in this epoch, took pains to host feasts, sponsor tourneys, and distribute gifts to those who served well. Though the Empire at large cared little for such gestures, House Targaryen recognized them as vital in securing genuine loyalty, or at least reducing the urge to revolt. And so it was that the Targaryens grew more influential within the Empire's circles. Other Dragonlord families often viewed Westeros as a backwater. The Targaryens transformed that sentiment into an advantage. Their presence on Dragonstone gave them an unmatched vantage point over the West. They policed the waves, intercepted trade routes, and minted new alliances. They bred their dragons carefully, selecting for size and ferocity. While the older families turned inward or sought new glories in far-off corners of the world, the Targaryens were laying the bedrock of an abiding power in the Seven Kingdoms. They acquired a reputation: stoic, strong-willed, capable of balancing the Empire's demands with local needs. Each new scion flew a dragon hatched from the ancient clutches, forging bonds with beasts whose roars echoed across the narrow sea. As Targaryen dragons aged and grew monstrous, folk in Westeros sometimes said that the family's seat was no lesser capital than Valyria itself, for it commanded every harbor within 1,000 leagues. Against this backdrop, tales emerged of hidden horrors lurking on the edges of the Empire. Rumors drifted in from the east of shadowbinders, necromancers, and abominations that thrived in the darkness. Some insisted that the unnatural energies fueling Valyria's might had awakened dark powers in distant corners of the world. Others whispered that the Red Priests in the temples of Rivalry had begun seeing new visions of a cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Word spread that in the far north of Westeros, beyond the massive ice wall that the Empire had largely neglected, fell creatures stirred. The Night's Watch, once a small order, found themselves patrolling a boundary that no one else seemed to care about. They sent ravens south with cryptic warnings. But who in Valyria's Golden Empire would heed the frightened talk of a few black-clad watchers in a land of endless snow? For all that, life continued as normal for most. The lords of Westeros, grown accustomed to wearing foreign silks and dining on exotic cuisine, gathered in their halls to play the game of alliance and betrayal, each hoping to curry favor with the Targaryens or, for the more ambitious, to catch the attention of the great families in Valyria. Court intrigues in King's Landing became labyrinthine, drawing spymasters and courtiers into webs of secrets. Those who sought to quietly foster rebellion had to navigate a treacherous environment. The watchful eyes of dragons made open revolt unthinkable, but subtle sabotage was always possible. A missing cargo here, a disrupted supply chain there, a quiet band of outlaws in the hills. Such small acts rarely disturbed the Empire's vast machine, but they gave the restless something to cling to. Over time, a clandestine network of rebels formed, exchanging coded messages hidden in shipments of grain or penned in the margins of ledgers. Their dream was to see the day when Westeros would free itself from Dragonfire. But that day remained a distant ideal. For now, Valyria was unstoppable, unbroken, an empire that believed itself to be the apex of civilization. When a new century dawned, the old families of Valyria gathered once again to discuss the empire's future. Instead of war councils, they convened for an event of celebration, the tricentennial of Westeros's full incorporation into the empire. Fireworks lit the night sky above Valyria's harbor, where hundreds of war galleys and merchant ships moored side by side. The city's spires and terraces overflowed with revelers. Dancers, acrobats, and performers from every corner of the known world displayed their talents. Slave markets closed for a single day in recognition of the holiday. Though no freedom was granted, the display was meant to show the Empire's benevolence. Ambassadors from Karth, and the Summer Isles came to pay homage, bearing gifts for the assembled Dragonlords. Among them was the Targaryen delegation, led by Lord Gaemon Targaryen, a tall figure with silver-gold hair, his eyes reflecting the pale violet typical of old Valyrian blood. At his side rode two of his children, each bonded to a young dragon that prowled the city's outskirts. Their arrival caused a stir, for their retinue included several prominent lords from Westeros, men who wore the fashions of their homeland and spoke with strong accents, but who showed utter respect for House Targaryen. The festivities masked an undercurrent of tension. Behind the music and feasting, the Dragonlord families negotiated expansions, trade deals, and, inevitably, marriages. At lavish banquets, they discussed the rumored fortune hidden in the sacked cities of Sarnor, the possibility of exploring the northern wastes, and the continuing flickers of unrest among the slave populations. They whispered, too, about the spiritual rift brewing among the Red Priests, some of whom were said to dabble in questionable sorceries. Yet, as always, the Empire's sense of invulnerability triumphed over caution. Many believed these were trivial matters, grains of sand in the vast machinery of Valyria. Were not their dragons the mightiest force under the sun? Had the 14 flames not remained quiet for centuries beyond counting? During these weeks of celebration, House Targaryen made diplomatic strides, forging new agreements with the more powerful families, who recognized Westeros as an increasingly vital region of the Empire. Trade from the Sunset Sea had grown, bringing rumors of lands even further west, and the Targaryens seemed well-placed to capitalize on any exploration. Much to their satisfaction, they secured a favorable position in the council that governed the West, effectively becoming the Imperial stewards over the entire subcontinent. Yet alliances in Valyria were never simple or wholly secure. Envoys from other major families, such as the Gainairs and the Elorions, eyed the Targaryens warily, unwilling to concede too much power in a single region. Subtle feuds flared, quiet words exchanged in private corridors, threats half concealed under smiles. Returning to Dragonstone, the Targaryens carried not only renewed authority but also seeds of rivalry with them. As they landed on their castle's basalt courtyards, the roar of their dragons echoing over the bay, they knew that their house stood at a crossroads. To rule Westeros effectively, they would need to cement ties with the local houses even further. But that would put them at odds with certain Valyrian families who preferred Westeros remain a mere tributary. In the months that followed, Targaryen messengers traveled to all corners of the Seven Kingdoms, summoning lords for a grand convocation at Dragonstone. Once gathered, these men and women saw the future unravel before them. The Targaryens sought to create a stable administrative structure for Westeros. It was to be a collaborative governance, with a council of lords that would handle mundane issues, yet always under the watchful eye of dragon riders. This, at least, was more representation than had existed under centuries of direct Valyrian oversight. Eager to preserve their dignity, many Westerosi lords agreed, so long as certain cultural practices and rites were honored. Thus formed the Assembly of Dragonstone, a new tier of governance that tried to balance tradition and the Empire's demands. Across the sea, some of the older Valyrian families scoffed. Why grant these conquered peoples a seat at any table of authority? But they did not see the subtle brilliance of House Targaryen's approach. By giving the Westerosi a voice, however limited, the Targaryens secured genuine loyalty. Rebellions declined, trade increased, and taxes flowed steadily into Valyrian coffers. For the first time, Westeros seemed to be a smoothly functioning province of the Empire, rather than a distant land forcibly subdued. This success bolstered House Targaryen's prestige considerably, drawing envy from many corners. Whispers spread that the Targaryens were building a personal power base that might one day overshadow the rest of the Empire. It was during this gradual shift that the first real signs of trouble emerged in the far north. Ravens arrived at Winterfell with disturbing reports of wildling raids that were more frequent and better organized than usual. The Lord of Winterfell, still a Stark though now deeply enmeshed in the Empire's structure, dispatched riders to learn more. They returned with stories of strange sightings, walking corpses, ice spiders, and eerie figures glimpsed under the glow of the aurora. The Targaryen-appointed governor of the north, a cousin to Gaemon Targaryen named Aelix, dismissed these tales as wildling superstitions. After all, the Empire had fought Shadowbinders and men who worshipped weird gods before. What threat could a few ragtag clans beyond the wall possibly pose? But in a fortress of black stone perched along the shivering sea, a far-flung outpost maintained by House Elorion, an alarming messenger arrived. The outpost's maester wrote frantic letters describing a skirmish with creatures that shrugged off steel. Fire seemed to work against them, but they came in numbers too great for a single garrison. The final lines of the maester's account ended abruptly, blotched with ink, suggesting an attack that overwhelmed the fortress. This was the first verifiable sign that something truly unnatural lurked beyond the boundaries of Valyria's domain. Yet these messages took time to travel the length of the empire, and even more time to be believed. Many in Valyria simply could not imagine a force that defied their dragons and legions. Meanwhile, in the lively courts of Dragonstone and King's Landing, the Targaryens and Westerosi lords planned a new festival to celebrate the successes of their alliance. Tournaments were arranged. Knights, still practicing the undull tradition of chivalry, wore Valyrian steelplate if they were wealthy enough, though more commonly they stuck to normal steel or boiled leather. A new generation of Targaryen princes and princesses mingled with heirs of ancient Westerosi houses. To the small folk in attendance, the kingdom of men seemed more glorious than ever, an unstoppable empire guarded by dragons overhead and blessed with prosperity. But a handful of old souls, especially in the north, began preparing quietly for winter. Direwolves howled in the deep woods, and the Stark's words, "Winter is coming," felt more relevant than they had in centuries. Amid these subtle shifts, a minor crisis in the Westerlands erupted when a gold mine collapsed, burying dozens of workers alive. Some of these workers were slaves taken from the Summer Islands and the disputed lands of Essos. Their lords demanded recompense. House Lannister appealed to the Targaryens to mediate. In another era, this would have been resolved by local feudal customs, but now it fell within the Empire's purview. The Targaryens stepped in, forging a compromise that saw House Lannister pay blood money to the families of the deceased. The Empire demanded an offering of gold as well, a show of contrition for losing valuable slave labor. The event seemed small in the grand scheme, but it revealed the precarious intersection of local tradition, imperial policy, and moral question. Whispers rose again about the nature of slavery in Westeros, a practice that had once been anathema to the faith of the Seven. Now it was woven into the imperial economy, with only minimal concessions granted to Westerosi sensibilities. Some rebellious priests in Old Town quietly insisted that a righteous uprising was needed to end such abominations. Others recognized that the iron fist of Valyria would crush any holy war. In the east, new illusions of glory tempted the old Dragonlord families. Word reached them of a powerful empire in ET, apparently unafraid of Valyria. Merchant ships told tales of a breathtakingly wealthy land, with armies that marched under banners of jade and sapphire, and rumored beasts of their own, WRMS or serpents that slithered through the jungles. The idea of conquering ET tickled the pride of families that had grown bored with administrating old territories. Targaryen agents quietly advised caution. Westeros had been challenging enough, and that campaign had required the combined might of many families. ET was vast, possibly more populous than all the freeholds provinces combined. Yet the lure of new conquests, new slaves, and new riches was enticing. A faction within Valyria's ruling councils pushed for an expedition into the Far East. Camps of legionnaires and dragons began amassing along the borders of Qarth and the Red Waste, preparing for what might become the greatest campaign since the subjugation of Westeros. Amid this swirl of ambition, House Targaryen found itself straddling two worlds. The high seats of Valyrian power, where illusions of unstoppable might reigned, and the more grounded realities of Westeros, where cracks in the Empire's facade were increasingly apparent. Wary of seeing the Empire overextend itself, Targaryen envoys tried to stall the eastern expansion. Their cause for caution was strengthened by rumors from the north, though no one in Valyria seemed to care. When the Targaryens sent dispatches describing mysterious threats beyond the wall, the larger families dismissed them as trifles. Even so, the Targaryens funded repairs to the Night's Watch, sending fresh supplies and occasional prisoner labor to help rebuild crumbling fortifications. House Stark, forging a cautious alliance with House Targaryen, took steps to investigate the uncharted lands beyond the wall, but found only silence and snow. A sense of unease crept through the weirwood groves, where old spirits seemed to stir. Over the next several years, a pattern took shape. The Empire's expansions in Essos demanded ever more resources, pushing them to increase levies and taxes in Westeros. While the Targaryens mediated to lighten the load, the burdens still grew. Local lords grumbled, small folk suffered, and faith in the Empire's benevolence eroded. Sporadic uprisings flared in the Riverlands and the Vale, often led by charismatic knights or outlaw leaders who invoked legends of ancient kings. Swift reprisals by Valyrian garrisons and Targaryen-led forces put down each revolt, but the cycle of revolt and suppression brewed an undercurrent of resentment. Meanwhile, the clandestine rebel network, once small and disorganized, began to expand. Their methods improved. Members learned to forge documents, infiltrate guard posts, and manipulate merchants. They lacked the force to challenge dragons head-on, but they plotted for the future, hoping that a single spark of opportunity might one day ignite the entire kingdom. It was in this tense climate that one of the greatest tragedies of the century struck. As the Empire's muster approached the Red Waste, preparing for the rumored invasion of ET, an incident occurred that shook Valyria to its core. At one of the staging grounds, a plague broke out, raging through the legions. Soldiers died by the thousands, their bodies covered in black lesions and their fevers racking them with seizures. Some claimed the disease was a sorcerous concoction from shadowbinders who resented Valyria's approach. Others believed it was simply a virulent pestilence unleashed by the massing of so many people. Dragons, too, were not spared. Some sickened and perished, fueling rumors that the plague was no natural affliction. Panic spread across the Empire. The prospect of an unstoppable disease that could fell both men and dragons was almost unthinkable. In desperation, the ruling councils recalled their expeditionary forces, halting the planned invasion of ET to contain the plague. For a year, the Empire grappled with this pestilence, quarantining entire districts in major cities. In the streets of Valyria, the stench of burning corpses rose, as authorities tried to destroy infected remains. The grand boulevards that had once overflowed with festivals were now patrolled by masked wardens carrying braziers of incense. Fear clung to the populace. Trade ground to a halt in certain regions as ships were turned away from harbors. Even in Westeros, where the outbreak was less severe, people whispered that the gods had finally found a way to humble the freehold. House Targaryen reacted swiftly. They enacted strict quarantine measures in King's Landing and Old Town, winning a measure of respect from local lords who saw that the Targaryens took the threat seriously. The plague ultimately subsided, but not before leaving behind tens of thousands of dead across the Empire. It was a reminder that Valyria, for all its dragons and wonders, was not immortal. In the aftermath, the Empire turned inward to rebuild, holding off on foreign conquests while they replenished their legions. Yet the appetite for expansion remained strong among many families, who saw in the plague's end a sign that they must prove their might once again. To quell any internal dissatisfaction, they directed their ambitions once more toward the east. House Targaryen, now thoroughly ensconced in Westeros, continued to object, urging the councils to address vulnerabilities at home first. Tensions flared in the capital, where subtle accusations were made that the Targaryens were becoming too Westerosi in their thinking. Some asked why the Targaryens cared so deeply about local rebellions or far-fetched tales of ghosts in the north. Others insinuated that House Targaryen was plotting to carve out its own dominion. Still, no official action was taken against them, for the Targaryens remained loyal indeed, sending their share of taxes, soldiers, and dragons for the Empire's causes. Their seat on Dragonstone remained an unshakable link to the power of Valyria, and no one was eager for open conflict among Dragonlords. Yet behind the scenes, certain families, such as the Gainairs and Coheri's lines, began forging alliances of their own, preparing to challenge the Targaryens' growing influence in Westeros. They sought to station their dragons and troops in key fortresses like Harrenhal, the monstrous castle that had been built by a local king centuries ago and later seized by Valyria's legions. Enormous and foreboding, Harrenhal sat near the God's Eye Lake, a strategic location in the Riverlands. If these rival families could dominate the heart of Westeros, they could curb the Targaryens' ascendancy. Targaryen scouts noticed these maneuvers and reported them back to Dragonstone, where Lord Daemon Targaryen considered his next steps. Strife among Dragonlords was a delicate matter. Open war could be catastrophic, and centuries of Imperial law forbade direct conflict that might weaken the freehold. But House Targaryen had no intention of yielding the West to upstarts who had spent little time cultivating alliances. Daemon decided to use diplomacy first, traveling to Harrenhal in person for negotiations, accompanied by 2 adult dragons as a show of strength. The meeting at Harrenhal was tense. Lords from the Riverlands, including some Tullis who had managed to maintain a shadow of their ancestral seat, watched anxiously as Dragonlords parleyed in the echoing halls. The Gaener Scions claimed they only wanted to ensure stability in the heart of Westeros, given rumored rebellions. Daemon offered them a role in the administrative council under Targaryen oversight. Pride clashed with compromise. The presence of dragons looming in the sky made violence an unattractive option for both parties. Ultimately, a brittle accord was reached. House Gaeners would be granted limited governance over a stretch of territory around Harrenhal, but it would remain subject to final authority from Dragonstone. This arrangement satisfied neither side entirely, but it prevented the outbreak of a Dragonlord civil war. To the Westerosi onlookers, it was a stark reminder that their homeland was a chessboard for the families of Valyria. In the months that followed, small irritations flared between Targaryen supporters and Gaener's overseers. Taxes, building projects, appointments of lesser lords, each issue became a potential flashpoint. Rebel groups tried to exploit this friction, but the Targaryens ruthlessly quashed any sign of an uprising, for they could not afford to appear negligent before their imperial peers. Still, these measures chipped away at the goodwill the Targaryens had built. More lords in the Reach and the Stormlands began to murmur about the oppressiveness of the Empire. The faith, too, grew restless. The High Septon, who had once welcomed the Targaryens as more enlightened Valyrians, found his new counterpart in Old Town less cooperative. The new High Septon preached that dragons were a test, not a blessing, and that the Seven might demand a great cleansing if sin continued unchecked. Yet the faith's power was limited by the ever-present threat of dragonfire. Words were all they had. While these internal tensions simmered, the northern threat loomed closer. Scouts from the Night's Watch and Stark bannermen reported sightings of entire wildling villages found empty. Their inhabitants vanished. Patrols along the wall occasionally glimpsed strange lights in the distance, or heard howls unlike any wolves they knew. Lord Stark sent a personal messenger to Dragonstone, imploring the Targaryens to investigate. A single dragon could do more in an hour of scouting than a patrol on horseback could accomplish in weeks. But the Targaryens, preoccupied with the rivalry at Harrenhal and the demands of the Imperial Council, delayed. They assured Lord Stark that they would address his concerns when time allowed, that the watchtowers along the neck would suffice for now. Privately, Daemon Targaryen assigned a distant cousin, Rhaenys, to look into the matter. But the flight to the north never took place. Rhaenys found himself caught in a flare-up of local hostilities in the Vale. The Watchers on the Wall saw no help arrive from the Empire. In this environment, rumors began spreading of a charismatic figure beyond the Wall. A man or creature known as the Night's King returned, or something akin to that ancient legend. No one south of the Wall believed it. The story was dismissed as fearmongering. The Watchers, though, had more tangible fears. They lost entire patrols to the frozen forests. Ravens failed to return. The wildlings who reached the Wall spoke of an army of the dead gathering in the Frostfangs. Their words fell on skeptical ears. Even so, the Watchers continued sending pleas for help, hoping that the Empire's fearsome dragons could drive away whatever monstrosity lurked in the winter wastes. Their letters reached no sympathetic audience in Valyria, and the Targaryens were swamped with trouble in the more populated realms. Then, in what would become known as the Ghost Harvest, the northernmost holdfasts on the Westerosi side of the Wall found themselves assaulted by the dead. Pale figures shambled through the night, ignoring arrows and blades. Entire villages disappeared, leaving behind only half-frozen corpses and bizarre ice-rimed shapes. Those who survived fled to Winterfell traumatized. The Starks mobilized their bannermen, but they knew mortal steel alone was insufficient. Winterfell's maester penned an urgent letter to Dragonstone, describing these events in excruciating detail, begging for immediate draconic intervention. This time, the Targaryens could no longer dismiss the matter. Daemon Targaryen recognized that if such a supernatural threat truly existed, it was a threat to the entire realm and to the Empire's dominion. In a bold move, Daemon mustered a flight of dragons and 2 legions of Imperial trained soldiers, placing them under the command of his daughter, Alysanne Targaryen, a skilled rider known for her calm judgment. They marched and sailed north with a sense of urgency, accompanied by a retinue of knights from the Westerlands, the Reach, and the Vale. Rumors of undead armies sowed dread among the troops, but most believed that dragonfire would be the ultimate solution. After all, the tales of old said that fire was the great enemy of ice. Alysanne arrived at Winterfell to find the Starks grim-faced, their usual northern stoicism cracked by desperation. The stories of ghosts and White Walkers were no longer mere fables. Some in the Targaryen force still doubted, until the first night they camped in the open fields and woke to find 3 missing scouts discovered dead, their eyes an unnatural blue in the last moments of life. Cautiously, the expedition pressed onward to the Wall, a colossal structure of ice that dwarfed them all. The Watch's numbers had dwindled over centuries of neglect, but they manned the ramparts as best they could. Their Lord Commander, a grizzled warrior named Brian Coldbrook, guided Alysanne to the top of the wall, where the frigid wind howled. From that vantage, she surveyed the landscape of ice and snow. In the far distance, she she glimpsed movement, shadows upon shadows. Her dragon growled, wings shifting restlessly. That night, a cold that seemed almost sentient pressed against the wall. Whispers of something ancient drifted in the wind, and the Watchers lit all the torches they could. Alysanne's legionnaires stood with swords drawn, glancing anxiously at the swirling darkness beyond. Some prayed to the Seven, others to the old Valyrian gods, a few to Lawler, begging for warmth and light. When the attack came, it began with a deathly silence. Shapes materialized from the swirling snow, silent as wraiths. The Watchers loosed flaming arrows, and for a moment it seemed an easy stand. The enemy, once men, now twisted by some terrible magic, fell when the flames caught them. But then more emerged, and more still. The numbers seemed limitless. The Watchers hurled barrels of oil from atop the wall, igniting a firestorm at its base. The night was lit by flickers of orange and red. Alysanne, mounted on her dragon, soared overhead, unleashing gouts of dragonfire that carved swaths through the advancing horde. For a time, it seemed the Watchers might hold the line, albeit barely. But then an unearthly cold wind blew in, snuffing out flames, and from the gloom stepped tall, lithe figures with eyes of burning ice, White Walkers. Their weapons of crystal and ice glistened in the reflected firelight. When they raised their arms, entire pockets of fallen whites stirred to life again, rising to march once more. Alysanne and her dragon attacked the White Walkers directly, but their freezing magic seemed to shield them. Even the dragon roared in pain as shards of ice punctured its scaled hide. Desperate, Alysanne circled around, scorching the land behind the undead, attempting to trap them between the wall and a ring of fire. Yet the unnatural storm that accompanied the White Walkers smothered much of the flame, swirling snow piling into drifts that extinguished the embers. Below, the legionnaires fought valiantly, forming shield walls to hold back the tide of whites. The Watchers fired from the ramparts until their arms went numb. The Starks and their bannermen, many of them wearing thick furs, clashed with the undead in the fields. Over the course of a single night, the ground below the wall was transformed into a battleground of ice and flame. When dawn finally broke, the undead drew back into the shadows of the forest. The Watchers tallied their dead and found the cost high. Among the fallen lay many legionnaires in armor bearing the Valyrian sigil of the freehold. Some had shattered into pieces of frozen flesh. Others had been dismembered by white assaults. Dozens of corpses had vanished, carried off by the retreating horde for unknown purposes. Even a second dragon, a younger beast than Alysanne's mount, had taken a fatal wound, crashing into the snow and snapping its neck in a final thrash. The survivors looked upon the battered field with horror. Only now did the Targaryens realize the gravity of the threat they faced. This was no minor incursion. The foe commanded cold and death itself, moving in numbers that defied imagination. With shocking clarity, Alysanne understood that if this undead army continued south, it could wreak havoc throughout Westeros, perhaps even threaten the Empire as a whole. She dispatched ravens to Dragonstone and King's Landing, urging immediate reinforcements. She implored the Watchers to gather more men, to hold the line while the Targaryens unleashed the full might of the Empire. But the Watchers, still too few, could do little more than staff the walls' castles. The North scrambled to defend its holdfasts, mustering every able-bodied warrior. The Southern lords, slow to believe these tales, delayed sending troops or sent only token forces. Dragons, after all, were the ultimate weapon. Why risk their own men? Yet there were not enough dragons in Westeros to form an impenetrable barrier. House Targaryen had only a handful of adult dragons ready for war. The other Valyrian families that might have helped were far away, and some, like House Gainairs, might even see this crisis as an opportunity to let the Targaryens falter. Weeks passed in a tense stalemate, with skirmishes erupting near the wall as the White Walkers tested the defenses. Each time, the Watchers and their allies managed to repel them, but at growing cost. The nights lengthened, and winter's grip tightened, threatening to starve the defenders. Daemon Targaryen recognized the severity of the peril. He used his influence in the Imperial Council to call for a united response, painting a dire picture. If Westeros fell, the undead might spread across the seas to Essos itself. Some families were unconvinced, suspecting Targaryen exaggeration to gain more power. Others demanded proof. Reluctantly, the Empire did mobilize a modest relief force, more legionnaires, a few dragons from supportive families, and supplies for a winter campaign. Yet the response was slow, hampered by internal politics. By the time these forces arrived in King's Landing, the North was already in dire straits. The undead had crossed the wall in several places, using the cover of storms and dark magic. Villages burned with ghostly flames. The once impenetrable barrier of ice was compromised in multiple sections. Even though large stretches of the wall still stood, it no longer functioned as a perfect shield. At Winterfell, a last bastion of civilization in the face of encroaching death, the Starks and Alysanne Targaryen made their stand. They retreated behind the castle's ancient walls, reinforced by newly arrived Targaryen legions. The crypts beneath Winterfell, lined with stone kings of old, loomed with uneasy significance. Some said the dead there stirred in their tombs, though it was likely just fearsome rumor. At times, it felt as if the entire weight of the Empire pressed down on this fortress, waiting to see if it would hold. If Winterfell fell, the path south lay open, leaving all of Westeros vulnerable. A desperate urgency took hold. They erected pyres all around the castle, keeping them smoldering day and night, using precious stores of wood and oil. Pikes topped with dragonglass, a rare resource gleaned from Dragonstone, were distributed to the defenders. The hour before the final assault was hushed, as though the world itself held its breath. Snow drifted from an iron-gray sky. Wolves howled in the distance. Alysanne Targaryen, astride her wounded but still formidable dragon, circled above the battlements. Lord Stark stood at the battlements in battered plate, broadsword in hand. His bannermen, a patchwork of northern houses, Mormont, Umber, Glover, Karstark, lined the walls alongside the black-clad Watchers, scions of House Targaryen, and the legionnaires from across the sea. Hundreds of fires lit the darkness, yet the cold swelled, seeping into bones, as if no amount of flame could truly banish it. When the undead horde appeared on the horizon, it was like a black tide washing over the white landscape. The horns blew, arrows and scorpion bolts rained down. The first ranks of wights advanced, shrieking an unholy chorus. Dragonfire lit the sky, and great swathes of undead were incinerated. But behind them came more, wave after wave, some climbing over the charred remains of their fellows. The White Walkers strode in their midst, commanding the ice and wind. The defenders fought bravely, but the walls were soon under siege. A monstrous ice spider, large as a warhorse, crawled up the ramparts, slicing through men with frozen mandibles. Inside the courtyard, a panicked swirl of sword and claw erupted. War cries mixed with screams. The living gave ground, step by bloody step. Then Alysanne brought her dragon down in a terrifying dive, blasting spider and whites alike with a cone of flame. The courtyard ignited in an inferno. The stench of burning flesh, living and dead, filled the air. For hours the chaos raged. Archers loosed every arrow they had. Spearmen stabbed relentlessly. The legionnaires formed shield walls behind blazing trenches, chanting Imperial battle hymns. House Stark's men displayed stoic valor, while the Watchers fought with the desperation of those who knew the fate of the world lay in the balance. A second Targaryen dragon soared overhead, unleashing fire wherever the undead threatened to breach the walls. But the White Walkers were cunning, focusing their icy magic on the dragons themselves. Razor-sharp shards of frost lanced into their wings, weakening them mid-flight. At the height of the battle, a storm unlike any other rolled in. Lightning flashed green against the swirling snow, and thunder reverberated across the fields. The temperature plummeted even lower. The defenders' limbs felt like lead, frost-coated metal and flesh. Some soldiers froze where they stood, their tears turning to ice. The White Walkers advanced through the storm, unstoppable. Even the dragons screeched in agony. Despair welled among the living. Lord Stark bellowed to rally his men, calling on ancient northern pride. Alysanne fought furiously from atop her mount, launching wave after wave of dragonfire, leaving swaths of undead in smoking ruin. But still they came on. The Watchers at the battlements realized that for every white they destroyed, 3 more emerged from the gloom. And then, from the blackness of the storm, a new figure emerged. A White Walker mounted on an undead creature resembling a dire wolf of impossible size. Its eyes shone a cold blue. It raised a blade of crystalline ice toward the ramparts. At its command, a column of whites hurled themselves forward, bridging a breach in the walls with their own bodies. The monstrous mount lunged, smashing aside defenders. A hush fell, as if the storm paused to witness the next moment. Alysanne spotted this figure and dove in for the kill, the dragon's maw agape with flame. Fire spewed forth, but an icy wind met it midair, scattering the flames. The White Walker rider brandished its sword, hurling a blast of freezing air that struck the dragon in the chest. A terrible shriek resounded. The dragon's hide cracked, frost racing across its scales. Desperate, Alysanne willed her mount to breathe once more. The beast exhaled a final gout of flame, engulfing the White Walker in swirling fire. For an instant, they both vanished in the inferno. When the flames subsided, the White Walker and its mount were gone. Whether destroyed or merely driven off, no one could say. But the dragon crashed into the courtyard, mortally wounded, crushing whites beneath its bulk and flailing in agony. Alysanne was thrown from the saddle, landing in a heap amid falling snow. Seeing their commander fall, the defenders nearly broke. Horror and despair rippled through their ranks. At that moment, Lord Stark himself pushed forward through the chaos, hacking down whites that blocked his path, determined to find Alysanne. A cluster of Watchers rallied to his side. They discovered Alysanne lying broken near the dragon's thrashing tail. She was badly injured but alive. The Watchers dragged her to safety, forming a protective circle around them. For the next hours, the fight teetered on the brink of disaster, the undead pressing ever closer. In that darkest moment, the Watchers found an unexpected ally. A group of wildlings charged into the fray from the open gates, armed with dragonglass weapons that the Watchers had shared with them in a desperate alliance. Their sudden assault from the flank sowed chaos in the undead ranks, buying the defenders precious time. Meanwhile, the second Targaryen dragon, though wounded, continued to scour the courtyard with fire. At last, the combined might of steel, dragonglass, and dragonflame forced the undead to retreat once more into the swirling snow. When dawn broke on the second day, Winterfell still stood, but barely. Much of the outer wall had collapsed or burned. Piles of shattered, burned white corpses littered the courtyard, smoldering in heaps. Soldiers huddled in exhaustion, many too tired or wounded to stand. The watchers carried Alysanne inside, where the Maester of Winterfell tended to her battered body. The cost of victory, or rather survival, was staggering. Hundreds lay dead or dying. A third of the Imperial legionnaires had fallen, along with countless northern warriors. The Targaryens lost another dragon that night, leaving them with only one adult beast in the north. And even that would need time to recover from its wounds. Word of the siege of Winterfell spread across Westeros, carried by traumatized survivors. Towns and villages erupted in panic. Some fled south, filling the roads to capacity, forming refugee trains that snaked through the countryside. The chaos threatened to destabilize the entire province. King's Landing braced for a flood of the displaced. The High Septon called for prayer and penance, while local lords tried to impose order. Still, many disbelieved the scale of the threat. Rumors ran wild, each one more horrifying than the last. In the imperial seat of Valyria, the news prompted further debate. Some families recognized the looming apocalypse and prepared to send more reinforcements. Others argued that Westeros was a distant frontier and that the Empire's strength would be better spent on new expansions in the east. The Targaryens found themselves fighting a two-front battle, one against the undead in the north, and one against the apathy and rivalries in Valyria. In Winterfell's Great Hall, Lord Stark convened a war council with what remained of the Imperial forces. Alysanne Targaryen, propped up on cushions, her limbs bandaged, participated with steely determination. She urged a bold plan: gather every available warrior, reinforce them with more dragons if any could be spared, and venture beyond the wall to confront the White Walkers in their domain. If they waited, the undead would eventually recover from their losses and strike again, perhaps at a moment of even greater weakness. Lord Stark agreed, with one caveat: they must unify every corner of Westeros behind them. They would need men from the Vale, the Reach, the Westerlands, the Stormlands, and even Dorne. The White Ravens had already declared it a long, harsh winter. A scattered realm would not survive. They must stand together now or be picked off one by one. But uniting the realm under the threat of an otherworldly foe was easier said than done. Old grudges, fear, and political entanglements in Valyria hindered the cause. Messengers rode south, carrying pleas for unity. The Targaryens stationed in King's Landing did their best to rally forces, pointing to the near fall of Winterfell as proof of the mortal danger. House Gainairs, controlling Harrenhal, expressed lukewarm support at best, still seeing an advantage in letting the Targaryens risk their own resources in the frozen north. House Lannister, wary of losing any more gold to foreign wars, hesitated. The Tyrells in the Reach dithered, worried about their harvests. Dorne, still nursing ancient resentments against the Empire, showed little inclination to march into snows for the sake of Targaryen overlords. Yet the fear of an undead cataclysm was not something any prudent lord could ignore. Some lords, guided by rumor, wonder, or genuine desperation, began gathering in the Riverlands, preparing to march north despite the fractious environment. The faith, too, found itself in a quandary. While the High Septon in Old Town continued to denounce the Empire's arrogance, some members of the clergy recognized that the living must unite against a tide of death. Their sermons, urging men to set aside differences, slowly gained traction. All the while, winter deepened, storms grew fiercer, and the White Walkers continued to roam the northern wastes, picking off isolated settlements. The night seemed endless, and each dawn arrived with a pale sun that offered little warmth. A sense of foreboding settled over the entire continent. More than a few souls wondered if the ancient tales of the long night would repeat, plunging the world into darkness and cold. Finally, under mounting pressure and continuing reports of horrors, the Empire stirred to more significant action. Valyrian ships, laden with soldiers and at least half a dozen dragons, sailed from Essos toward Westeros. They disembarked in the Crownlands, forming an imposing force that marched north under the banners of several Dragonlord families. The Great War for the Dawn, it seemed, would soon be joined. For all their internal rivalries, the Dragonlords at last recognized that an enemy impervious to steel might yet be vulnerable to dragonfire if enough beasts were arrayed against it. The legions, disciplined and well-equipped, brought siege engines, war chariots, and wagons of supplies. As these forces converged, House Targaryen found itself at the center of a grand alliance. If they could coordinate the efforts of so many disparate factions, Northern Bannermen, Southern Knights, foreign legionnaires, multiple dragons, and the watchful eyes of other Valyrian families, perhaps they might drive back the White Walkers for good. Yet the final success or failure remained uncertain. The undead had no fear, no need for rest, and the White Walkers commanded a primal power that seemed to defy nature itself. The night that had nearly claimed Winterfell could descend upon the entire realm. In the days leading up to the planned offensive beyond the wall, tensions ran high. The combined armies gathered in the cold plains south of Castle Black, forging a camp that stretched for miles. Smoke from countless fires rose into the wintry air. War councils were held in heated tents, where Dragonlords discussed strategy with the Lords of Westeros. Each possessed their own ideas. Some insisted on a swift strike, unleashing all the dragons at once. Others wanted to probe the enemy's weaknesses with smaller sorties, wary of traps. Meanwhile, the Watchers scouted beyond the wall, returning with stories of entire forests turned silent, devoid of animal life, as if the dead had consumed every living thing. Amid these preparations, new alliances formed and old grudges festered. Westerosi lords who once scorned the Empire now found themselves reliant on dragonfire. Valyrian lords who once belittled Westeros realized that the fate of the entire Empire might hinge on these frigid battlefields. House Targaryen, caught in the middle, worked tirelessly to keep the uneasy coalition together. Whether or not they would succeed remained to be seen. But one thing was clear to every soul in that sprawling war camp. The true test was yet to come, and the cost of failure was unthinkable. As horns sounded in the distance, and flights of dragons circled overhead, men gazed northward with hearts pounding, knowing that if they did not stand united in the face of this dark winter, even the might of Valyria might prove fragile before the rising darkness. Far away in the seat of the Empire, the streets of Valyria still bustled with life and pride, the aftereffects of plague and political strife gradually fading. The city's folk believed themselves the apex of creation, their dominion absolute. The dread of the North was but a whisper to them, a distant rumor overshadowed by grand expansions and feats of sorcery. Yet if the armies in Westeros fell, if the Targaryens and other Dragonlords failed to stop the White Walkers, that distant rumor might one day become a reality at Valyria's doorstep. The swirling clouds above the 14 flames remained untroubled by volcanic fury, but in the hush beneath the city's foundations, the seeds of hubris still lingered. The doom that had not come centuries ago might find a different path to strike at the heart of the Empire, whether through the unstoppable march of the undead or some other unforeseen calamity. For now, though, the fate of men, dragons, and an unbroken empire hinged on the next moves in the frozen wastelands beyond the wall. And in that frozen gloom, the White Walkers waited, patient as the grave, ready to test the arrogance of dragons and the resolve of mortals alike.